Thanks for joining us for this talk with Ben Beckwith about site migrations. And please go ahead and hop in the chat and tell us where you're joining from and what drove you to sign up for this session. Are you going through a migration now? Do you have one on the books coming up? Do you just want to commiserate with us about how challenging they are? I'm super pumped. Ben has a really engaging and informative session planned, and he's going to talk through some of the best case and worst case scenarios of what can happen during a site migration and provide some insights that will help us do our next migration better. So I wanted to give you a little bit more personal background on our speaker so you can know where his base of expertise on this topic is coming from. So Ben Beckwith is the Director of Organic Marketing at a leading multi-award-winning digital agency called Semetrical, based in the UK. And he's got 7 years of agency-side digital marketing experience. Ben's worked on a variety of industry websites, publishers, and marketplaces are a couple of the highlights, from startup stage to major global brands, B2B, B2C, SaaS. So he's got a really broad perspective on what kinds of site migrations we can face as SEOs and what can go right and wrong. In fact, Ben shared he's worked on more than 100 from rebrands to replatforming to web property consolidation, major site restructures. So running really the full gamut of what we mean when we say site migration. Ben, in fact, once worked on a project that involved replatforming 140 sites for one brand within 6 months. He calls this the highlight of his career. I call this a serious bout of indigestion. Awesome. So we are really in the hands of an experienced expert here when it comes to site migrations, and looking forward to having a fruitful conversation. We've left room at the tail end of this to answer your questions. So use the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen, not the chat, to submit questions, which I'll be fielding while Ben's doing the heavy lifting here. And one quick note before I hand it over to you, Ben, we do have a short survey at the end, which should take no longer than 60 seconds. We'd love it if you'd complete that and give us ideas for future topics that could be valuable for these sessions. We are recording this, so you'll receive, every registrant within a week of today will receive a link to the recording and a summary write-up blog post with additional resources. All right, Ben, take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Anne, for that introduction. And yeah, we've got a jam-packed webinar for you today. So the webinar we're going to cover today is what are site migrations and the different types of migrations, why we should be involving the SEO team right from the outset, how do we overcome objections and getting internal stakeholder buy-in, best practices to achieve a successful website migration, and common pitfalls that me and my team have experienced over the years that I wanted to share with you today. So I guess firstly, what do we mean by a website migration? Well, a site migration is when a website undergoes changes related to its setup. It can range from URL changes, to completely moving a website to a new destination. Site migrations can be a super complex process. However, when handled with care and attention and with the right planning in place, it can be simplified. So don't get overwhelmed. No one wants to see a migration fail, but when it does, it is really not a pretty sight. In this scenario, a website moved on to a different domain and its traffic never recovers. A clear example of making sure migrations are handled with care. However, on a more positive note, here's an example of a successful merger migration where you can see the website that was disappearing, its kind of clicks trickled off, and the website that being merged into, its clicks started to increase gradually over time. So it's a nice kind of visual of a successful website merger migration that you'd hope to see. Under the umbrella term of website migrations, there's many different types that you may have come across or maybe have experienced. You've got domain name changes. This is kind of where your domain name may have changed from example.com to example1.com. You've got URL cleanups where you want to make the URLs a lot more user friendly. So you might have URLs of just ID strings. You want to make them more keyword rich. You might be merging content. So you might be merging two articles into one article. You've got website redesigns. That's kind of when the look and feel of the website might be changing. You've got platform changes or CMS changes. That could be where you're moving from a Drupal CMS to a WordPress CMS. HTTP protocol changes, that's where you're going from a HTTP to HTTPS. It's a small change, but it still is classified as a website migration. TLD changes, where you might be going from a .co.uk TLD to a .com TLD. You got structural changes, where you've got content that maybe sits under one category structure, and you're moving it into a brand new category. A lot of the time, URLs change at the same time. You've got merging websites, where you're merging two websites into kind of one. And finally, kind of a subdomain moving to a subfolder. In that respect, you kind of maybe going from a .blog subdomain to a /blog subfolder. Always involve the SEO team from the beginning. I must emphasize this. An SEO brings a lot to the table when it comes to website migrations. Typically, they'll have experience working across lots of different types of migrations over their career. So they'll know the best way to how to protect traffic and also kind of rankings. With each type of migration, there's different considerations that need to be taken into kind of consideration at the end of the day. When you've got a URL change, that's going to, search engines are going to crawl that differently to when you're kind of merging one website into another. But SEOs normally have experience of these different types of migrations and kind of know kind of what's the best approach going forward. They'll also kind of review all the risks associated with a migration and different changes, as well as educate stakeholders on the risks associated with kind of what is going to be implemented or changed on your website. And with most migrations, it's always a good time to capitalize on opportunities. A lot of time you might have a backlog of technical issues that you've maybe had for the past few months, or even maybe the last year or so. But if you're kind of doing a migration, you've got the developers on board, it's always a good time to kind of get some of those technical issues pushed through at the same time. A lot of time, the SEO team will be able to identify kind of what opportunities to capitalize on. The SEO team also pick up on things that typically other stakeholders may not kind of identify throughout the migration process that would have had a negative effect on the migration. Issues of my team that I flagged and my team have flagged over the years is legacy redirects not being moved. What this would happen is you might have done, other URLs might have changed over the years, or other migrations may have happened, and they might build up backlinks or authority. You still want to make sure these legacy URLs are being moved and redirected at the same time as the new redirects that you're putting in place. Priority URLs just not being migrated. This is when you might have priority URLs that generate a lot of traffic to your website, but ultimately some of them have just been missed and not been part of the mapping process, or haven't even been included on the kind of staging environment so that URL will never exist again, or priority articles have not been catered for. And planned URL changes. It's actually more common than you think, and it's happened quite a lot for the migrations that I've been on, where you might have the content team who decide when you've got to the kind of pre-migration testing phase to change some of URL structures, which were never in the initial scope. It can cause havoc, and you just take a step back. But at the end of the day, you just need to kind of understand what those URL changes are and make sure you've got testing in place. But ultimately, it can kind of cause issues with kind of timelines. Canonicals referencing the staging URLs. What happens here is if you kind of go live with your kind of live website, but the canonicals are referencing the staging URLs, it's going to be very difficult for that production environment to be indexed via search engine, because it's always going to be finding the canonicals of the staging environment. Website's not rendering. This more happens if your website is built in JavaScript, so it's not applicable to everyone, but always make sure you're kind of testing kind of the Java, I guess the pages that are built in JavaScript on your website. Are internal links being rendered? Is content being rendered? Worst thing you want is you go live, you spend all this time on the website migration, you come to realize that a search engine just isn't able to render your page, and it kind of has a detrimental effect on traffic and rankings. Googlebot being blocked. I've experienced this a few times where a client had kind of blocked Googlebot and other user agents from actually crawling their website. So if we kind of went live, Google just wouldn't have been able to crawl the website at all. Not updating internal links. So internal links referencing the old legacy URLs. So if we went live, we would have had lots of 301 redirects or 404s, which you just don't want. Legacy URLs in the XML sitemaps. Ultimately, you kind of want XML sitemaps only to kind of reference the kind of new URLs that are going live to make it very easy and quick for kind of Google or other search engines to uncover them and index them. Culling URLs with backlinks. Ultimately, if you kind of cull URLs that have backlinks and they're not going to redirect into the new website or the website you're migrating, you could have a detrimental effect on your domain authority. So whether it's the SEO team, the growth marketing team, or someone else in the organization actually leading the project, it's important to get internal buy-in from the outset before the planning even starts. If you don't get enough budget, required resource, or time to complete the migration properly, there's a high chance of the migration failing. So a forecast model showing worst case and best case scenario with revenue, traffic, and leads will show a powerful story to hopefully get that buy-in from kind of stakeholders. Let the data do the talking. Ultimately, if a company kind of saw that they're going to be losing potentially £1 million worth of revenue a month, the migration wasn't successful, I'm sure that's going to turn their heads and hopefully get them thinking in a different direction, hopefully giving the required team the right resource, the right budget to kind of have a smooth migration. However, that doesn't always work. So you also need to be educating internal stakeholders on migrations and also what's actually involved within the migration process to hopefully get that buy-in, to get that resource, to get that budget, to have that, like I said, a smooth migration. So you need to kind of educate them on kind of what's involved in the migration process and ultimately kind of what's the risks associated with the migration that's going to be taking place. However, even if you do that, it doesn't always go to plan, and you still struggle to sometimes get the resource required and the budget and the time frame to actually get the migration done successfully. So if all else fails, try and mitigate the risks and losses with available resources that you've got at hand. So what I would be doing here is identifying your priority URLs that have traffic, have backlinks, and kind of make sure that they're catered for in the migration process and are migrated across. You also want to be involving different stakeholders within the organization and different stakeholder groups, because they need to be included in the migration process. Ultimately, they need to understand what's at stake for them and get them on board. This is the best time when you want to be making friends in the organization, where you have the paid media team on board, as well as, for example, the CRO team. Ultimately, with paid media, they could be affected because their campaign URLs might be changing. They could 404 if they don't update their campaign URLs at the same time, or they'll go through redirects. Also, their quality scores might be changing. Ultimately, if the look and feel of the website's changing, or the content on the page is being taken off or being adapted, that can hinder their quality scores. They need to be aware of that and be involved in the process. The analytics team needs to be involved, mainly because they need to make sure tracking is moved over when the migration takes place, and also kind of if any new web properties or analytics properties need to be set up, that they're on board to help you. Social media team, essentially their campaign URLs can be affected as well, because URLs might die off in 404 or redirect. Dev team, they're essentially going to be the backbone of a lot of this project. You're going to be probably relying on them for redirects to be taking place, to get technical issues pushed through. So they need to be involved right from the outset. CRM team, when you're sending newsletters, URLs might be changing. CRO, if the look and feel is changing, if you're restructuring the navigation and the kind of hierarchy has been adapted, that can affect the user flow and the user journey. So you want to make sure they're kind of overseeing it to make sure it's not going to have a detrimental effects on your audience and your users. Product team might need to be involved. Also, the content team, because you might be adapting the content. You might need content resource to kind of write lots of new intro copy or content for different category pages or product pages. So you need to get them involved in the project. And like I mentioned from the outset, make sure the SEO team are involved right from the beginning. So when coming on to the best practices, it's important to work through the 5 key stages of website migrations. Each stage does serve a purpose. You've got planning and scoping, pre-migration preparation, pre-migration testing, on-the-day support, and post-migrations. So if we move on to the planning and scoping. So you want core objectives need to be defined and important questions need to be answered. One of the main questions is, why do stakeholders want to migrate? Will the migration actually solve the pain points of what the stakeholders have? Has of all other routes been looked at? Ultimately, the migration should be the last resort. Main reason for that is it can take a lot of money, a lot of resource, and there's a lot of risks associated with a website migration. So you want to make sure that every other possible route has been looked at before you actually get to the migration stage. But however, if you come to the realization that the migration is the best way forward and the stakeholders are on board for it as well, then what is the business hoping to achieve and what does success actually look like? We need to make sure everyone's on the same page with kind of expectations. You don't want the marketing team or the SEO team going, okay, well, a successful website migration for us is when we migrate, we don't see a drop in traffic, and we kind of stay stable. But if you've got internal stakeholders who are going, all right, we want to migrate, but we also want a 30% uplift in traffic that's going to come along with it, that's potentially going to be very unrealistic. And everyone's on a different page. So when you get to the end of the project, you're going to have some very tough conversations to be had. So ultimately, right from the outset, you want to make sure that everyone's on the same page and we kind of know what the success look like across the organization. And finally, what migration is actually taking place. You need to kind of know what is the migration, what migration is happening. Is it just URL changes? Is it a merger project? Because that'll inform the scope of the project and what kind of checklists and kind of planning needs to be put in place when you get to the pre-migration planning and testing phase. I always recommend to migrate a website when it's a low season. Yeah, not all websites and all verticals are affected by seasonality at the end of the day. But however, if you're in a vertical where seasonality will affect you, please, please, please migrate in a low season. Because even if you've gone through the whole checklist and you've done all process for a website migration, there still is a risk that you potentially might lose a bit of traffic at the beginning once you go live. So if it happens in a seasonal high, it's going to have a detrimental effect on revenue potentially, as well as traffic. So you don't want to put yourself at that. You don't want to put yourself at risk there. So always do it in that seasonal low, where if something does go wrong, it's not going to have a detrimental effect on the bottom line. A project plan should be created. It should set out tasks, key milestones, deadlines, and accountabilities. It helps keep the project on track and for stakeholders to know when should they be feeding into the project, when certain changes also may be too late to be implemented. There'll be tasks which have dependencies as well. So you want to make sure that people understand when their tasks need to be done before another task can take place to kind of prevent any delays happening within the kind of testing or the planning phases. You also need access to a lot of data sources. This will help for priority URL identification, which we'll touch upon in a minute, and also kind of benchmarking. The main data points that you need is analytics access. So that might be Google Analytics, or kind of Search Console, or your other analytic platforms that you might be using. This is going to give you session data, conversion data, bounce rates, and giving you kind of all the data points that require to help with URL prioritization and to help inform the URL mapping process. Rank tracking access. You need to get all the keywords and all your priority keywords tracked. That'll help more from the benchmarking perspective to kind of know kind of where you're ranking now for a given keyword, so you can compare that post-migration to make sure you haven't dropped ranking-wise. PPC, you're going to need access to Google AdWords and kind of Bing. Main reason for that is that'll help identify what URLs are the paid media team using, plus also understands which are the high kind of converting URLs from paid media that might help inform prioritization as well. Backlink platforms, so the likes of Ahrefs, Majestic, that's going to help with URL prioritization as well. So that's going to tell you which URLs have backlinks and which URLs are the most authoritative on your website. But then also, I'd recommend providing dev teams with the IP address that your crawler is going to be crawling from before the project starts. Main reason for that is a lot of the time, staging environments, even sometimes live environments, certain crawlers will be automatically blocked from crawling. To prevent delays, if you kind of make sure you give your dev team the IP address that you're crawling from, this prevents any delays happening, and it means your crawler can kind of crawl the staging environment as well as crawl the live environment as well. So now we move on to the pre-migration preparation. So we need to review plan changes. Depending on the migration that's taking place, there could be a lot of changes being made, but also very little. It's very important to review all the changes being made to your website, which normally includes navigation changes, taxonomy changes, and page template changes. Because for each change that is going to take place, you need to kind of put testing in place to make sure that it doesn't pose any risks to the website when it goes live. And then making sure kind of anything that's kind of been spec'd out, you can test against it to kind of make sure it aligns with kind of what was, scoped out from the beginning of the project. Priority URL identification. So I'd always recommend identifying your priority URLs that needs to be protected. Like I said, you need multiple data sources that can determine this list. And that comes back to that slide where we needed to get access to all those different data platforms. Because this will help with the URL mappings and also making sure that your priority URLs do exist on your website and you can kind of test those URLs in the staging environment To identify these URLs, you need to crawl the existing website, the legacy website, to kind of get a list of all the URLs that currently exist, getting data from all those analytics platforms to get the session data to identify what are your traffic generating pages, as well as converting pages, backlink data to identify authority URLs, traffic from kind of pay media accounts as well, so from AdWords or Bing. Social share data could be useful. You might want to make sure you're protecting URLs that have been shared a lot over different social platforms over the years. And also stakeholder priority URLs. What I mean by this is there'll be certain URLs that maybe aren't a priority for the SEO team or for other marketing channels, but there'll be certain URLs that are really important for certain stakeholders. So you need to kind of make sure you're communicating with the stakeholders internally within the organization to make sure that any URLs that are critical for them and their channel are included within the kind of website migration and are getting carried over. If URLs are changing, which most likely they will be in one way or another, the URL mapping document needs to be built out and provided to your dev team. The URL mapping document lays out where the URL will be moving to, along with the kind of status code that the development team needs to implement. More often than not, it should be that 301 status code. This will also include the new redirects that are going to happen, but also legacy redirects and legacy URLs that need to be mapped to kind of new URL destinations. Also, the size of the website will determine if potentially you are going to map all your URLs one-to-one, or if only priority URLs are going to be mapped one-to-one. Depends on kind of what time frame you've got as well. Also, you might be coming across a website where the taxonomy is changing. So a category is changing from one naming convention to another, or a whole category structure is disappearing and getting migrated into another one. In that scenario, we need to be providing the dev team with a taxonomy mapping document as well to kind of tell them which ones are changing and where they're going to. We need to get benchmark metrics in place before the migration is even taken place. This will help with reporting and kind of success measures when you compare pre and post migration results. You want to make sure that priority keywords are being tracked prior to the migration taking place, as well make it easy to spot any ranking drops post migration. The main data points will be priority keyword rankings across desktop and mobile, site speed and page loading times for key templates, snapshot of branded SERPs, and URL level metrics for your priority pages. That might be average conversion rate or kind of average organic traffic. I've added a couple of links within this webinar that you'll probably be able to get off the blog after when Deepcrawl upload it, with a couple of templates. This example template here is a benchmarking document for tracking keywords. So you'll get the rankings for the keywords that's happened pre-migration and the URL ranking for it. And then you can get the snapshots 24 hours after the migration, and then for the weeks to follow to kind of make sure the rankings are stabilized and the right URL is actually ranking. We move on to the pre-migration testing. You want to make sure your staging site is blocked from all search engines. It's imperative that it's blocked from all search engines when you build a staging environment. And the staging environment is critical because that's where you're going to be doing all your pre-migration testing. There's different ways to kind of block a staging environment. My preference would be an authentication layer where you need a username and password, but that's not always feasible. So another way to block would be to add a disallow rule to the robots.txt file, adding a no index tag to the head of every page. When you are crawling a staging environment, and I emphasize that you should be crawling it over and over and over again. You don't want to just crawl it once. You need to be checking and testing your staging environment multiple times throughout the whole process to make sure there's no critical tech issues. If you have added authentication on your website, you'll need to enable your website crawl to pass through that. I'm sure people will be using lots of different kind of crawling platforms. I typically use Deepcrawl. So if you are using Deepcrawl in the advanced settings and the test settings, you can enter the staging URL along with the username and password, so Deepcrawl can get behind the authentication layer to crawl your staging environment. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to crawl it. If you've added a disallow all rule to the robots.txt file, you'll need to select the robots override functionality in Deepcrawl. I'm sure other kind of crawling platforms as well will have the same functionality as well, so you can get behind the kind of either robots.txt file authentication to be able to crawl your site. And there's lots of different technical issues that you want to be looking out for. Duplicate content, 404s and broken links, empty pages causing soft 404s, pages not rendering correctly, missing canonical tags or canonicals referencing those incorrect URLs, missing metadata on the pages, missing schema or structured data, internal linking optimization, and page templates not reflecting those initial wireframes that were scoped out right at the beginning of the project. Within the staging environment, verify your redirects are working by getting the developers to set up functionality where redirects can be tested. Following the technical reviews, remove the legacy robots.txt file as well and those rules, and add the new ones before it goes live. So once you've done the crawl, you're going to identify certain rules that don't matter anymore, don't need to exist on the new site. Plus also there'll be new rules that you need to add to the robots.txt file. Then we move on to on-the-day support. So once your site has gone live, immediately test those redirects, especially on those priority URLs. I've tested redirect rules in the staging environment, which work. But once I've gone live, some of those redirects just don't go to the correct destination. So never assume the redirects are going to work. Always check them immediately after the website has gone live. Crawl your priority URL list, checking for the technical issues, followed by running a full site crawl. The reason why you want to do this is you want to check for critical technical issues straight after the website's gone live. Again, never assume everything is technically sound. I've faced it where I've tested the staging environment, technical issues are being fixed, website's gone live, and some of those technical issues have reappeared again. The reason why you want to split out the tests as well is if you've got a large website, it can take quite a while to crawl that website. So if you get your priority URL list and run a list crawl on them first to make sure everything is technically sound, you know you're in a pretty good place, and then allow kind of a full website crawl to happen in the background, which could take up to a day or two, depending on how big your website is. Once your website is live, double check all the tracking codes on your site and to prevent any loss of data. Again, I've experienced website migrations where it's gone live and certain tracking codes have been removed from templates. So you have a small gap in data. So validate tracking codes immediately, as well as check that all the kind of URLs have been reflected in the paid ads accounts, in the marketing accounts, and any affiliate campaigns. Make sure all the other stakeholders have updated their URLs to make sure it's not going to affect other marketing channels. When we move on to post-migration, after the migration has taken place, the project, unfortunately, is not complete. It needs to do ongoing technical kind of monitoring and checks. In the weeks to follow, you want to set up a scheduled crawl of the website on a regular basis, which kind of reruns in the background to keep on checking that there's no new technical issues. You want to crawl the priority URL list on a regular basis, continually crawl redirects as well to make sure the redirects haven't stopped working, which can happen as well. Don't just assume from day one when the redirects are in place, they're going to stay in place. Things can happen. Review Search Console for any messages or errors. Monitor site speed and call Web Vitals. And also monitor 404 pages. You want to make sure that if traffic is going to 404 pages, look to see why. Is there a URL that shouldn't be 404ing that has? And make sure it's not affecting the user journey. Also, regular monitoring of rankings and traffic is critical post-migration. You want to make sure kind of this, because at the end of the day, this provides visibility of traffic and also ranking movements, whether they're positive or negative. If drops do occur, this data can help pinpoint maybe when it did happen and what pages are affected. This makes it easier to reverse engineer where maybe something has gone wrong. Typically, I would have this set up for at least the 3 months following the website migration. So you're monitoring the rankings and you're kind of monitoring kind of traffic reports and sending KPI reports and kind of, traffic performance reports to stakeholders on a regular basis. Once we've gone through the kind of best practices, I also wanted to touch upon some common pitfalls. Over the years of doing numerous website migrations, me and my team have come across lots of kind of issues or common pitfalls that do happen. And I wanted to try and cover just some of these on this webinar. So hopefully you don't come across these pitfalls or can try and get around them. So the main ones is not testing redirects till post-launch. That's a common pitfall that I've seen from other companies, but also with clients that have done a website migration, then come to us because the migration has failed. And ultimately, you need to test redirects within the staging environment so you can kind of make sure they're kind of working and they're going to the correct end destination. Rushing migration projects, that's also an issue, because if it's rushed, it means certain tasks might get left out. Certain checks might not be checked in depth. And then a bug that maybe you've missed will go onto the live environment and then it could have a detrimental effect on the website. Scope change partway through, it happens. And sometimes you can't do anything about it. But again, you could be in post-migration testing and you've got a content department or another department going, I want to change the URL structures of this section of the website. It has a knock-on effect on timelines. robots.txt file not being updated. You've gone live, but you still have that disallow rule in place. So Google and the search engines just can't access the website to kind of crawl the website to kind of, see what changes have happened. Not doing rigorous testing on the staging environment. Again, like I emphasized, you need to test over and over again. You don't want to be taking any critical tech issues over to the live environment because it's going to hinder the success of the website migration. Not testing JS rendering. Again, that's only if it's applicable. But ultimately, if your website isn't JavaScript, utilize tools to make sure internal links are being rendered, the content can be rendered. Not agreeing on clear objectives. Again, you might have the marketing team are going, the objective is a smooth migration and we don't lose any traffic. Other stakeholders, their clear objective, we want a 50% increase in traffic. It doesn't align. Not backing up the website. You always want to have a backup of your website so you can always roll back. When you kind of go live with website migration, it's not always going to go smoothly. If you've got that backup, you can always roll it back until you get the fixes in place. Also, and like I mentioned earlier on, launch in a low season, don't launch within a seasonal high when doing the website migration. And then just some useful tips that I wanted to kind of share with everyone as well, which is across different types of website migrations, is make sure you're tracking priority keywords prior to the migration taking place. Annotate when the migration went live in your analytics platform. This allows you to do a historical analysis in a year to come. So you kind of go, why did we see a drop in traffic or an increase in traffic around this date range? And then you can kind of correlate it back to, we did a website migration. Decide which URLs don't need to be migrated. Migration is a fantastic time to clean up URLs and clean up sections of your website. So decide which ones maybe don't need to be moved over and you can kill them off. If changing domains, use the change of address functionality in Search Console. It makes it a lot quicker for the likes of Google to kind of pick up that the domain has changed to a different destination. Run paid ads if you're changing domain name or consolidating sites. The reason for this is if you're changing domain name, that's most likely you're going to be changing your brand name as well. People are going to be searching your old brand name for the weeks and months to come. So if you have paid ads at the top of Google, it provides a nice user experience to kind of tell someone, well, I've typed in this brand name, but you're serving me this different website with this different name. But if you have a paid ad saying X brand is now rebranded to X brand, provides a nice user experience and they understand, okay, I know why I'm going to this website now. And then move and update the disallow files if your domain is changing or if you are consolidating websites. I know kind of some people might not keep their disavow files up to date because spammy links Google will ignore to a certain extent. However, I just like to do best practice a lot of the time and kind of have a safety net. So make sure if you are migrating one domain into another, move that disavow file over and combine it, because you are redirecting URLs and you can be bringing those signals over as well. And then finally, the key takeaways that I just want you to kind of take away from the webinar is get an SEO on board from the beginning. Use data and educate stakeholders for buy-in is essential. Create friendships amongst the organization. So you can kind of lean on the paid team. You can lean on the CRO team to support you. Key objectives need to be agreed before the project gets going. A project plan with accountabilities along with checklists will aid a smooth migration. Test and audit the website over and over and over again. Identify your priority URLs. Make sure benchmark data is collected. Test mappings and redirections prior to migrating if possible. It's not always possible. If you can, please do it. Review tracking and campaign codes to prevent loss of data. And finally, monitor performance post-migration. So it means you can kind of act on any traffic drops or ranking drops immediately and kind of identify where the root cause is and kind of rectify it before it kind of gets out of control.
I think it's okay to stay on your key takeaway slide while we walk through some of these Q&As, Ben. Maybe you want to mute yourself for a second and take a slug of water. That was a very dense presentation, and I can tell you from the chat that folks were super engaged. We topped out at 138 participants and we only lost 8 along the way. So that's another sign that your content was super valuable to all the folks who joined. The slides will be sent out, Autumn. Great. We have some super juicy and thorny questions for you to grapple with, Ben.
Sounds good.
So I'll dive in with a couple of quick wins and then we'll dive into some of the meatier stuff. The first question came from Manisha. She asked if you could please define what a TLD change was in reference to a site migration.
Yeah,
Could you give
sure.
us an
So
example?
yeah, so the TLD change here was migrating from a .co.uk domain, moving over to a .com. Or if you were migrating from a .eu domain and then you migrated that over to a .com as well. It's very common when you're doing international kind of consolidation projects where you might have lots of websites on international TLDs where it's a .eu, a .fr, a .co.uk. So it'd be example.co.uk, example.eu. But then we might migrate all them onto a centralized .com domain and then move those kind of TLDs, which are .co.uk or .eu or .fr, into a subfolder of .com/fr or .com/uk to make it to I guess to consolidate equity.
Those are thorny indeed. International SEO is its own headache.
Yeah, it is.
Another quick question for you, Ben. This is a two-pronged question. How long should we keep redirects in place after a migration? And what happens when we redirect some of the URLs? Let's say there's not a one-to-one match anymore to what the content was. Is there some challenges that you can surface when you have to do that in bulk, redirecting to not a really relevant new destination URL?
Yeah, so keeping redirects in place. Funny enough, it was last year. John Muller did a kind of a talk on website migrations, and he kind of said keep it in place for at least a year. Your redirects, but so that's the minimum that you want to keep a redirects in place for. Ultimately, you want to keep them in place for as long as possible at the end of the day, because ultimately, if you've got URLs which have backlinks and it has authority and equity, and Google and other search engines are going to keep on kind of crawling third-party websites that are kind of linked to you, you want to make sure kind of those backlinks will be counted and be followed on a regular basis. So a minimum of a year, otherwise as long as possible. In regards to your second question, I would kind of say, yeah, a lot of the time you will have a challenge where you can't map everything one-to-one, or you've got a whole section that needs to be mapped to a different section of the website, more to kind of aid the user journey and doesn't create lots of 404s. So sometimes you can do wildcard rules. And for wildcard rules, what you could do is, well, a wildcard rule can work in multiple ways, but one way it can work is you might have a load of URLs that sit on /blog, and you can kind of do a rule which kind of goes, any URL path that runs off /blog can all get mapped over to this new destination, which might be /blog/news. And that allows you to kind of map a load of URLs in one go to a brand new kind of destination. So it inherits the new subfolder. But when you've got URLs where you don't have a destination to go to, unfortunately, sometimes what you need to do is map it to the nearest alternative. Challenge sometimes there will be that nearest alternative might not be, still the best option because that page might have been ranking for a given keyword. But then if you map it to a near alternative, that new page might not be able to rank for the keyword or keyword set that original URL was ranking for. So you need to cater for that in your forecast model, where if you do have the limitation of not being able to map one-to-one, bake into the forecast model that, okay, well, we've got these URLs, but if these other URLs can't be mapped and the nearest alternative is X URL, but it's still not going to rank for the same keywords, we're also going to lose that traffic. So cater for that in the forecast model to try and get stakeholder buy-in, see if you can get those URLs reinstated on the live environment so you can do the one-to-one. Ultimately, you just can map it to a category page, which isn't ideal, but at least it doesn't break, at least it keeps users on the website instead of going to a 404 page. But you need to just take note that if you're going to map an article, for example, or a product page to a category page, you're going to be losing that traffic. It's a category page can't rank for the same intent of a keyword to what that product page or article page was ranking for.
Ben, I'm thinking of scenarios where in bulk, pages that we've decided not to bring over to the new site are going to be redirected to a category page or to the home page. Can you think of a scenario in which, due to the intentional abandonment of the keyword intention of the content that we're not bringing over, it might be better to let it 404 rather than potentially broaching the negative effects of bulk redirecting a bunch of stuff that's not relevant back to the home page or category page?
So no, 100%. So this is kind of where you could be doing the URL cleanup that I mentioned as kind of one of those tips where not all URLs do need to be migrated over or kind of mapped over into the architecture. So if the URLs, if you just literally don't have an alternate option for a page and you don't want to map it to a category page or to a, if you can identify a similar article, map it to it or a similar page. But if you don't have that, I agree. A 404, allowing it to just go to a 404 is ideal, but just make sure that URL doesn't have any equity. Make sure it doesn't have any backlinks, because if it does have backlinks, at least if you're kind of migrating, if you're mapping that to a near similar URL, at least then that backlink is still going to be inherited and that authority is still going to be inherited within the domain as a whole. Where if it 404s, unfortunately, that link's going to die off as well. So you're not going to benefit from that kind of backlink in the future.
I'm going to skip ahead to a different question because we're in the weeds here on redirects and signals you'd use to evaluate which pages are a priority to redirect. So Paul talked about how he's working on an audit for a client that went through a migration 10 months ago and they've suffered a massive decline. And they surfaced that there are a ton of internal redirects, some of which are going through hops, and wondered how you would go about prioritizing which of those to fix first. You mentioned backlinks as one signal.
So if you've kind of experienced a big kind of traffic drop, I'd probably be identifying the URLs which are your big traffic generators prior to the migration taking place and kind of prioritizing those first to get them fixed. Because if you're kind of, if you've redirected thousands of pages, some of them might attribute to about 5 or 10% of your overall traffic, but maybe a small percentage of your website could attribute to 80% of your overall traffic. So if you can kind of zone in on those URLs first, and I think you talked about redirect chains potentially, that may be one of the issues. I'd then zone in on those pages and kind of rectify the kind of one-to-one redirects for those. So I'd identify the original destination of that URL and find where the new destination needs to go to, and then take those URLs, work with the dev team to prioritize that list first to kind of go, can you remove the redirects that are currently in place for this URL that ends up at this destination, and try and, I guess, reset the redirect rules that are in place in the back end so your developers can just do a one-to-one instead of, kind of a redirect going to another URL, which then goes through another URL to another URL chain.
We've got a lot more questions coming in, so I'm trying to field those as we go. There's a really interesting question that just came in. You had a slide early on in the presentation about why it's important to crawl the staging environment and what to do day of immediately when the new site goes live. So the question has to do with, should we put any blocks in place on the new site, maybe a robots.txt disallow, so we can do a final audit before opening it up to the public? Would you advise that, or can that go wrong?
It can go wrong. However, it's a pretty good option to do. So if you want to do a final check on the live environment before it goes live, you could put a robots.txt disallow all rule so it doesn't get crawled. However, once that website goes live and redirects are in place from the old destination to the new destination, Google's going to start crawling those URLs, or at least another search engine is going to start crawling those URLs. And when it starts to crawl them, and then it finds the new destination, and it is a blocker. Google's or another search engine is trying to visit that new destination where it's ended up, but it can't find that new destination because it's a disallow all rule. It's gonna cause confusion to the redirect rules that you've put in place, and then it might take a few extra days for then a search engine to come back to then reassess that redirect rule again to see where does it end up. So it could delay the onset of kind of a search engine re-indexing your new URLs and your new redirects. So ideally, don't kind of set ideally on your kind of live environment, don't put a disallow all rule in place and then do a last minute check. If your redirects are already in place from the old destination. However, if the redirects haven't gone live yet, and you've literally just got the new website in place, and there's no signals to signal to a crawler to try and visit that new website, then a disallow all rule is fine. But again, if you've got the redirects already in place from the old destinations and it's referencing the new website that you've blocked, it's going to delay. It's going to delay a search engine from visiting. And I've experienced that before, where a disallow all rule was put in place on a website. Redirects have already been implemented. The developers implemented the XML sitemap in the Search Console. So we're sending all these signals to Google or other search engines going, please crawl all these old URLs to follow the new destination, and it's getting blocked. And we're getting a ton of kind of error messages in Search Console for a few days. And it actually took a good couple of weeks for the search engine to reevaluate all those redirects to kind of then abide by that rule. And it also depends on the size of your website and the crawl frequency of a search engine. Because if your search engine doesn't come and crawl your website that frequent, it could even take longer than a couple of weeks to kind of reevaluate those redirects. But if you're a large website where it gets reevaluated and recrawled on a regular basis, it should only take a few days. Yeah, so hopefully that answers that question. It was a bit of a
No, for sure. That was easy
there.
to follow, Ben. There's like many things in SEO, it depends, but it sounds like it's inadvisable because of the potential downside risk.
Yeah, exactly. Unless, as long as you're not sending any signals to a search engine to crawl that new environment, then it should be fine. But if the signals have already gone, the train's left, and ultimately, it's going to be negative. It's going to have a negative effect.
All right, so I'm going to pivot to what I promised, which is the meaty and thorny challenges. Estam shared a really difficult but fun question.
Okay.
So Estam is working on a site with a planned migration where there's a lot of things changing all at once. I'm going to list them off. You're going to be intimidated. There's a new JavaScript platform, a new hosting provider. They're implementing partial server-side rendering.
Okay.
They're changing URL structures and the visual design and implementing a new internal site linking architecture.
Okay.
So Estam wants to do some modeling and predict how long and what kind of impacts are going to happen. Can you think of, with so many variables changing at once, how can you do any real forecasting?
Yeah, it's a pretty big challenge, that, I'm not going to lie. I guess ultimately, if he's going to be doing it all in one go, I guess all those changes are going to happen all at once. I guess what you could start to do is, sometimes what I've done for like technical issues is sometimes looked at case studies of other people implementing similar type of changes on websites that are across online, to kind of see what percentage loss they maybe experience from doing X change or Y change. And you can bake those percentage drops or increases into your model. Otherwise, based on all those different changes that are taking place, at the end of the day, whatever migration really happens, if I was migrating one domain into another or just restructuring a website, Google or any other search engine's got to reevaluate the website, and if it's new URLs, it's got to reassess all those URLs from the beginning. If you're going to be restructuring a template, it needs to be reevaluated. So in reality, based on you actually having to do so many different changes, I wouldn't say you've got to build bespoke models for doing X change and then doing this other change. I think it's just taking in consideration for a general website migration where URLs change and templates have potentially changed, what potential drop do people see? And just having to, it is a bit of a finger in the air at the end of the day, but build, worst case scenario and kind of best case scenario and take it from there. But because you've got 6 or 7 different things happening all at once, I don't think that's a reason to kind of go, it's going to overcomplicate your kind of modeling, because at the end of the day, migration is a migration. You can make quite a lot of different changes. So I would just kind of take a step back and just go, well, if we're making all these different changes, what do we think potentially could be that loss? Or, look at some case studies of someone's done a URL change, maybe saw a 5% loss there. Someone moved to a JavaScript type framework and they saw a 10% drop for the first 3 months, and just maybe take an average of those different percentage drops and bake that into a model. But yeah, that's a bit of a problem, or a bit of a complex question, let's say.
And it sounds like a difficult migration to be juggling all those pieces at once, just in terms of being able to UAT it as an SEO. But I think that's what's great about the SEO industry, is that folks do really share examples and case studies that we can then look to help put together some of these models. So that was a really helpful answer. We have folks in the audience who are agency side and dealing with not having access to all the data they would need to do some of the best case scenario planning that you've suggested. You know, maybe they don't have access to first party data, so they can't see Search Console, they can't see analytics to be able to identify what are the priority trafficked URLs and how should we be, you know, organizing our 301 redirects. And, you know, in one case for legal or regulatory reasons, they don't have access to the staging site. So have you worked with a partial blind spot before on a site migration, and, you know, what went right and what went wrong?
Yes, unfortunately I have, and I can feel the pain. I've always then resorted to third-party tools like SEMrush or other kind of, you know, competitor analysis type tools where, you know, they've got a pretty good database of keywords and they can tell you, you know, for your own website or the client's website, what keywords they're ranking for, and also their top URLs that are generating traffic. It's not going to be 100% accurate, but at least that's going to fill some of that blind spot. And that's kind of one way to, you know, to do some prioritization. You know, they give you a good data set to kind of work from at the end of the day. And I'd be taking kind of data points from, I guess, as far back as possible from these third-party tools to kind of aid that. And then I guess you can use backlink tools at the end of the day. I'm sure from an agency, you'd have access to maybe Ahrefs or Majestic to identify the URLs that have backlinks. And then hopefully that should protect it to a certain extent, because then you've identified pages that have the authority. So you don't want to lose that. And then hopefully using SEMrush or another third-party platform, you've identified maybe not 100% of those priority URLs, but you'd hope that you've identified the ones that generate the meat of your traffic, because the database of SEMrush and other platforms normally will help highlight those, you know, those key URLs that are generating traffic to your site. So at least if you can cater for them, it might protect 90% of your traffic. And you might see that 10% loss because you might have that blind spot, but at least it's better than potentially losing half of your website's traffic because you're guessing what kind of what URLs to kind of to redirect or to kind of cater for.
Thank you, Ben. Let's hop to the next slide and wrap up. I see a lot of folks have to jump at the hour. I'm going to use an American phrase and say, you really knocked it out of the park. Folks have been singing your praises in the chat, and particularly having enough time to really pick your brain with detailed questions, I think was super valuable. So we're very grateful for your time. As I've mentioned in the Q&A, if it feels like Deepcrawl could be helpful as you're facing some of these site migration issues, feel free to reach out for a demo, get a demo crawl of your site and see if the data would help fill some of these blind spots for you. And we do have some content already up on the website. I encourage you to check that out and look for some of the previous webinars that we've done. We've got a valuable set of technical guidance there. And please do fill out the survey at the end to suggest future topics. I've captured all the questions we couldn't answer today so that I can make sure we do address those in our summary blog post. And thank you for attending.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.